It's 5 o'clock here in Copenhagen, so a warm welcome to this seminar on the Digital Services Act, or maybe I should say welcome to this seminar where you'll now become a lot wiser on the new sheriff in town. It goes by the name DSA, Digital Services Act, and that was obviously, as some of you have guessed, a quote by the French Commissioner Breton, who sort of basically used this expression a couple of weeks ago when there was a big debate about the DSA. He's one of the commissioners very active on this piece of legislation. It was presented back in December 2000. Obviously, the Danish commissioner, Margrethe Vestager, also plays a vital role in this process. And also to quote one of the speakers here today, Christel Schaldemose, what is this all about? This is about combating digital pollution. So this is what we'll be talking about today, making sure that our fundamental rights are protected when we are active, when we engage in online activities, just as they are when we are offline. So basically, this will be our topic, and what will the DSA do? Well, among one of the major aspects will obviously be that it will set up a number of new rules for tech platforms like Meta, Google, and so forth. For instance, requiring them to take down content or illegal products. This, you could say that we are experiencing digital pollution. I think one could also say that we are witnessing this as we speak, maybe in a completely different way than we could have imagined, because now we also have war propaganda taking place. So this will obviously also be a topic that, at least during the question time, I'll ask our two speakers to comment a bit on. We are in the process now where we have the final negotiations sort of just about to take place. I saw today on Christel Schaldemose, and I'll introduce you in 2 seconds, on your Twitter that you actually had a meeting today with Commissioner Breton. So I'm very excited that you have also been able to participate in this webinar today, and also very grateful. Also, this has been a very emotional day also in the European Parliament with the debate about Ukraine. So we are very, very grateful that you have taken the time to be with us here today. I personally cannot recall that we've had such an important piece of legislation. We've had 2 Danes being at the heart of the process, Margrethe Vestager and you, Christel Schaldemose, as the rapporteur for the European Parliament. So basically, what will this DSA mean for Europe? And since I know you a bit sort of personally, I also know I can reveal that you have kids at home. So maybe we could just start the following way. How do you explain to your kids how this DSA will change their online activities? And then after that, please sort of enlighten us on the overall sort of process of where we are in the end game. And then I'll introduce our second speaker, Claes, afterwards. So Christel, over to you, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, Lykke, for inviting me, and I'm really grateful to be here today and have an opportunity. I can see that we also have international guests, but in mainly a Danish audience, to have a chance to discuss the DSA. But you know, I should have thought about your question in this respect. So I should have thought about how I could explain it in a football context. But unfortunately, I have not found a way to do that. But what, you know, my kids are grown up now, or almost the youngest, he's 18, and you know, they are on social media, and we talk very much about this. And for me, when I try to explain to them what it is about, then I tell them it's about creating a rule book for the platforms, the social media and social digital services, in order to make sure that we kind of get rid of the Wild West and make sure that it's safe for them and they have some rights when they are online. So that's basically what I'm trying to explain to them. And then they are trying to explain to me how the social media works. And then we have a discussion about how this goes on. No, but I think that it might be difficult for many people to really understand what the DSA is about. And I think that once we have adopted the legislation and it is entering into force, I think that people will realize that it will work and make their life online somewhat different. I hope at least that is what we're trying to achieve. Because I mean, in many ways, I think that the Commission's proposal on the DSA was a good starting point. But we have a lot of issues we need to tackle. And you know, I'm a big fan. I myself use I shop online and I use social media. So I also have a very online life. But I also see the challenges coming out of this, the fact that we use platforms so much. And we have seen, for instance, the interference in democracy. We saw the US election. We saw the storm on the Congress. We saw Cambridge Analytica, and we heard also from the whistleblower from Facebook, Frances Haugen, about how things work. So now we have the last examples is here from the war, Ukrainian war, where we have seen a lot of disinformation and use of social media also to try to bring out a specific point of view on what is going on. So in many ways, we need to make sure that we have rules so people can trust what is taking place online. And that's what we're trying to work with. You know, first let me say a little bit about the process. I mean, we are in the trilogue, which means that we are in the final phase of the negotiations. The Commission presented a proposal back in, I think it was the 15th December 2020. Just before the Christmas holiday, and then we have spent a year, 2021, on trying to find the mandates for the Council, you know, the member states, the ministers, and we have done it here in the Parliament as well, and we voted our mandate through the plenary in January this year. And then at a certain time we had to meet the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament and find the final wording on the text, and that's where we are now, and we have had 2 trilogues at the moment. We haven't seen such a great move yet, but you know, it's also part of the system that we need to try to understand each other's positions. And I expect that when we go into the 3rd and 4th, maybe even 5th trilogue, then we are approaching a result. And let me say that from the European Parliament side, we have 3 focal points. For us, we think it's extremely important to create transparency and accountability on algorithms. We want to open up the black box of algorithms. We want to make sure that assessment about how their algorithms work, what kind of effect they have on democracy, on users' mental health, for instance, young girls' health, and in many ways, how do they affect the users and the society they're working with, and if there is a negative impact, mitigate this impact so that it will have a more positive impact. And I believe we heard from Frances Haugen, for instance, one of the big Facebook, for instance, they tend to, in order to have us to stay as long as possible on the platforms, they wanted to give a preference to negative content, because with negative content we have a tendency to involve, engage, dislike, share, and do a lot of things, and we do that more with negative than with positive content. So they prioritize this kind of content over the positive ones. And with this new legislation, if we get these measures in place where they have to be accountable for their algorithms, then they have to mitigate the risk, so that they have to make sure that it doesn't have this negative impact, so that we risk a new storm on the Congress or whatever. So they have to really look into how this works. So that's one of the things. We're also trying to make sure that we're looking into the business models of the platforms. We as users, we pay with our data when we use the platforms, and we lose more and more control over our personal data. And in many ways, we see that big techs, they use our data to promote personalized behavioral advertising. And in fact, in many ways, you can say that this is the core model of their business. It is advertising. They harvest our data in order to sell ads. And therefore, we're looking into, is this really an acceptable way of doing things? At least for minors, we would like to have a ban on targeted ads, tracking ads for minors, because we believe that that's a way to stop some of it. But we even also hope that we can go further, banning some of the unfair commercial practices used online, for instance, using dark patterns. We all know it when we go on a media website. We see that we have this, we have to give consent, and yes, it's often green, and the no is often gray. So I have a tendency to push on green ones. That's the dark pattern. We also have other kinds of that, but we would like to ban these kind of practices, and we want to give the users more choices so that you also have a choice to have a chronological order of your feed rather than one that is based on your behavior online. So we're trying to do a lot in order to give us back the control over our own data. And finally, we try to create a level playing field between online and offline services. We know that marketplaces, they have an issue with especially goods coming in from third countries. Especially they are not safe, or at least many of them are not safe. And so online shopping is with less rules than offline shopping, creates an unfair level playing field, and we're trying to do something on that, giving consumers more rights, asking the platforms to make random checks, etc., etc. So we're working on that as well. So these are the main focus from our side in the Parliament. But what is important for us to make is especially to make sure that we have this trustworthy online environment that is not causing any harm to neither the users, the consumers, the citizens, or our democracy. And that's what we are aiming at. And we hope that we will be finalizing this piece of legislation, hopefully, maybe in April, but hopefully at least in May. And I do believe that's possible. And I would like to see that if we had this piece of legislation in place now here during this crisis, I'm sure that the accountability on algorithms, the transparency around that, the risk assessments and the risk mitigation, that would probably have made it more an obligation for the platforms to start early on to try to get rid of, for instance, disinformation and misinformation. So in many ways, I do believe that we would have seen less pollution online with disinformation if we have had the DSA. However, having said this, I don't believe that the DSA will be, this silver bullet that will solve all the problems. We also need to look into other issues, and there is also a balance between, making new rules on the platforms and, for instance, making sure that we have and respect the freedom of speech, for instance, so that we cannot narrow too much down what the platforms are allowed to do. But I do believe that with this DSA being finalized, we will be more safe businesses, consumers, citizens online, and that is what I want to achieve.
Excellent, thank you very much. And before I give the floor to Claes, so where do you see sort of the main sort of battleground in the negotiations? I mean, you mentioned sort of the European Parliament's point of view. That's obviously also your task. But where do you see that they will have tension also with the Council, basically, or maybe some of the member states? Can you just say a few words on that?
Yeah. Thanks. That's clear. I should have said something about that as well. I mean, there's no doubt that we are discussing, for instance, the governance structure, who should do what. Normally, when we make legislation on single market, we say that we have this country of origin principle, meaning that it's the member states who will have to enforce the rules. However, talking about the very large online platforms, we see a tendency that it's more tricky. We have seen it with GDPR and Facebook and other things. So we are looking into how can we do this. This is a discussion about how to find the best balance. We are also discussing how many platforms should be exempted from these rules. Here I see some issues as well. But I do believe mainly that the biggest discussion is probably around how to go into the business model, the targeted or tracking ads question. That is one of the things that I really expected, or I already now see that we have some issues around. However, I tried to say to the Council that I don't want us to see it as we're fighting each other, because we are together able to create a legislation that will make it safer for Europeans online. So we should have that in focus instead of fighting each other. And I hope that will be the end, that we see it in the same way.
At least there's another fighting taking place at the moment, so that sounds like a promising way to look upon it. Before I go to Claes, remember that you can all ask your questions in the chat. But before I go to Claes, I've been puzzled by one thing, and I know obviously you are a member of the Social Democratic Party, you are a member in the European Parliament, so you have not been invited here to present the Danish government, just to be clear about that. But I've just been a bit puzzled by the Danish debate that we now have this big legislation sort of being negotiated at the EU level, but at the same time, we have a national process in Denmark about making apparently what I've been able to understand some specific Danish rules. I mean, how is that sort of process sort of taking place in practice? Why not wait for the EU legislation, or is there something that I simply have not really understood in that process? Probably.
Well, I see it as maybe something that can go hand in hand.
Okay.
So in the vacuum between once we have adopted this DSA and before it enters into force, we don't know how long that will take. Sometimes it takes some months, maybe even years. Then it could maybe be useful to have Danish legislation that could kind of fill in this gap. And I also think that they are sending signals from the government side that they want to have more control over the platforms, that they need to have responsibility towards the society where they are, making their business on behalf of, not on behalf of, but the society where they are making the business. So I think that they see this as a way, to take a debate, discuss it, use the media negotiations about the new media law in Denmark also to find some solutions, maybe discussing also financing issues. So I think that they use it, they try to fill out the gap and hope and expect that they can go hand in hand once we have adopted the DSA. That's also how I see it.
Okay, good. Thank you for clarifying that. Now, Claes, now we go to you. You work both in Denmark and in the Netherlands. Usually that's no problem at all, I presume. But just before we went online, where we discussed that there's this football match taking place in Amsterdam, and you have tickets for it, Denmark playing against the Netherlands. So this will be exciting. But on a more serious note, we have obviously invited you because you are one of the true specialists, one of the professors dealing with artificial intelligence, with a special focus on media and democracy. I've also seen that you have launched this new important center at the University of Southern Denmark, SDU, as some of us still call it, on digital democracy. So who could be more qualified than you sort of to give us an overview of the linkage between the larger digital platforms and democracy? Well, I could not think of anyone better. That's why I invited you. So now the floor is yours. Claes de Vreese.
Thank you very much, Lykke, and thank you also for raising the stakes here in my intervention. I think it is important to take a step back and also look at the DSA and the discussion that we just had as sort of a long overdue coming to terms with something that has grown both organically but also super rapidly over the past decade and a half, right? And if you look at our democracies and democratic processes, it is almost, there's no end to the place in which big tech companies and digitalization and new technologies have taken a real center place, right? If we just think about elections and how parties are organized internally, the type of advertising that is taking place online, it touches on all of these aspects about targeted advertising, transparency issues, who is saying what, who is getting what messages. If we think about how our entire public sector is organized, from everything to tax authorities to municipalities to our ministries, and the role of digital technologies and services in the public sector, and then we get to the entire media sector, which are on the one hand sort of heavy users of these new technologies in their own production and their own distribution of content, and then the big and rather complicated relationship that they have with the big tech platforms and the social media platforms. On the one hand, super dependent on them, and on the other hand also super frustrated by the hollowing out of their business models. So if you look at all of that, you really see that our entire sort of democratic process is challenged and has also provided a great deal of new opportunities. But the DSA, in combination, I would say, also with the discussion very specifically on political micro-targeting, in combination with the European democracy plan, in combination actually also with the EU regulation in discussion, is sort of a long overdue multi-package a discussion that will start setting the ground rules for what democracies will look like for the coming period. And this is really, really overdue. And from that perspective, I think that the comparison with sort of the environment and whether or not we are facing pollution is one. I might prefer a little bit more to consider this as part of an infrastructure discussion, right? There's, in all of Europe, we have infrastructure, whether it's trains or whether it's airspace or roads. We have never left that 100% up to the market. We have agreed on rules and regulations there, and we need to consider this also as part of a very crucial infrastructure that is so structuring for our societies. And I think that analogy is sometimes can be a little bit more neutral than maybe the climate crisis and pollution analogy. If we were to bring it to football, however, I would probably say that currently the big tech companies maybe have the sort of the reputation level of the UEFA and FIFA right now. That's tough news for them, but that they are not always seen as being the right movers in a lot of discussions, and are being challenged in also how they act. And I think that is also something that we're seeing with big tech companies, where you have of course seen from the past sort of 5 to 7 years a move from don't touch us, we're a business, we're neutral, we are the key drivers of innovation in your continent, to okay, we acknowledge that there are some issues we have to grapple with, to saying, okay, we lay down regulated, but that's a bit of a smokescreen, right? Because they are not really willing to maybe go through very hard regulation right now. And I think the debate that we are having at this point in time of how can you devise a set of rules that does this sort of long due update to the playbook and the rules of the game, and at the same time also maybe avoids us now carving in stone a new set of rules that will, in 10, 15 years look like the directive for broadcasting or something like this, that is currently still guiding some of our thinking in this area. That is a real key challenge for devising and implementing these rules, that we also need to think of them as something that will be in need of continuous updating, and that goes particular when it comes to some of the digital technologies and to the rollout of AI. So I think that as a sort of a key set of challenges in deep recognition of the profound impact that these technologies have had on not only democracy overall, but each and single part of the democratic processes, how we interact as citizens, how we interact with politics, how we interact with our services and public administration.
And how optimistic are you with regards to the game-changing effect of this DSA piece of legislation, Claes? Do you see it as really sort of changing also the global environment with regards to this? I mean, is it a new sort of golden rule, a golden standard, just like we saw with the GDPR? I mean, that it will seem to just change, that everybody has to adapt to it, or as we say within the academic community, that we're experiencing a new Brussels effect. So Brussels starts to regulate, then everybody has to follow along. Is that what we should expect?
Well, there's no doubt that this, as Christel also framed it, it's not like the silver magical bullet that will solve all issues at once. But it's also clear that in the global perspective, if anyone is going to take a lead in trying to think about a new set of rules, it's going to be the European Union right now. So from that perspective, I think this is good news. There is a lot, though, where the devil is in the detail, right? Once you unpack everything that has to do with content moderation and balancing freedom of speech versus undesired content, when you look at different types of categories of vulnerable or marginalized groups that you want to protect in particular, if you look at discussions about whether or not to shut down services, I think what has happened in the past 48 hours, where we have had an unprecedented discussion of taking down state media, and where the EU has led some of the political sort of heavyweight pressure on the platforms to actually take down Sputnik and Russia Today from some of their platforms, and the domino effect has sort of been rolling from one platform to the next as that happens. That's monumental, and at the same time, there's also, at least on my side, this sense of it is never healthy to devise these kind of policy mechanisms and game-changing mechanism in the midst of big crises like that. I mean, we wish probably we had a situation in which platforms, as well as perhaps the EU, had this conversation outside of wartime, right? Because these are really, and they come with side effects. What are our criteria for determining which media we want to advocate to have banned from political standout? I have a lot of sympathy for, I think, the emotions and the faults that have led to this, and maybe also on a sort of very personal and non-scientific note, could also see why you would do something like that, at least in temporary fashion. But I think it opens up this box where the details of all of this are extremely important for whether or not the DSA and the adjacent regulations will turn out to have the desired effects.
Yeah, because I saw that the Commissioner Breton just said, I think it was 2 days ago, that freedom of speech, well, that's obviously, I mean, vital, but freedom of speech is not something you can say when it's war propaganda. But what's your take on that? Because as you indicate, I mean, where do you have the decisions and so forth? I mean, that's a very difficult discussion, I presume, as you indicated.
It's very difficult. I mean, which kind of media would apply for a ban like that? In which situations do we feel comfortable with the European Commissioner leaning in on big tech platforms and strong arming, pushing, having a dialogue for them to take it down? For which period of time is that relevant? What is the definition of a state medium? How much propaganda would you have to have there? What does that do to also the ability, I think, of us who are not on the ground to actually see and analyze and have access to the war propaganda that is flourishing on these machines? How big do you have to be as a market player to be part of this kind of regulation? These are all unresolved and big issues, and again, on a personal note, I think I have a lot of sympathy for the discussion and the inclination to go down this road. But I think opening this discussion of the balance of wanting to have EU commissioners weigh in with platforms in the midst of the heat leading to bans. What does the ban actually entail? What does it actually imply? For how long is this ban? These are all unresolved questions, and that is a path that I think we need to tread extremely cautiously as a society going forward. And the sadness is, of course, that we have the discussion literally in the heat of the moment.
Something just happened to our sound there, but now you're back. But Christel, how does, I also asked that at the beginning, and you actually also made the connection between the war and now also the DSA. But can you sort of at least enlighten us even more? I mean, if the DSA had been in force, what would then have been different with regards to our decision-making process? Could we have done something that we could not do now, or would we have to do it a different way simply because the DSA was not in force? Can one answer that question?
Well, I mean, I can answer at least from the European Parliament side. If the text we have would have been the one we adopted, I think that first and foremost, the fact that the platforms needed to have done more earlier on in order to, you know, kind of work with their algorithms to maybe not get rid of, but at least scale down the amount of posts where you know, you saw some fake videos or, you know, disinformation in general. So they had, with the DSA in place, they would have been obliged to do more to first and foremost see their algorithms, how did they work, what kind of impact, and if a negative impact, they had to do something to mitigate the risk. So there's no doubt that they would have been looking much more into it and probably even reacted earlier on this, you know, in the weeks coming up to the invasion of Ukraine. There's no doubt that they would have been acting early on. And I believe, I will not answer on behalf of Breton, but there's no doubt that the Commission probably have seen, you know, that they did not do enough until he took the meeting and put a pressure on them, saying that honestly do more, because what is happening is not acceptable from a society point of view. But of course it is, as Claes is saying, it is better to have legislation in place, and therefore I have had this discussion with Tom today about, can we do something to incorporate a better wording on how to act, especially in these extraordinary circumstances. And we haven't found the wording, but we are starting a discussion saying that maybe we can do more. We have had a discussion about media exemption. Should we exempt certain medias from content moderation from platforms? For instance, the Danish radio have seen some of their kids programs being taken down because some of the big platforms didn't like them. And we have, honestly, we have weird kids programs. We love them, us Danes, but they, from abroad, they look maybe a bit weird. John Dillermand and other kind of persons, cartoons, they are kind of, weird. But Danish radio and other public service medias wish to have, right to not be content moderated from the platforms. So we were discussing how to do this. But one of the discussions why I think it was difficult to really have a clear media exemption in place was because rightly we had a discussion. If you then exempt just in general media, then what about Russia Today? So we ended up saying we could not make a general media exemption, but we have suggested in the terms and conditions that they also need to comply with media laws. And I think, and I hope that we can get that through some way or the other, but there's no doubt that we need to look into how we can get the platforms, because it's not us politicians and it's not the Commission who should decide, but we should have a law in place. And on that basis, the platform should work with the terms and conditions and the content moderation and do more to avoid negative impacts on society. And that is what I prefer, rather than having this, interference. But we see history in the making in these days. What is happening in the EU at the moment, I would never, ever, with my 15 years of experience in the Parliament, if somebody asked me a week ago that we would buy weapons and send to Ukraine, that the Commission would interfere in these ways that we would have done, I would say never, ever. So things are changing very fast.
Yeah, it's very dangerous to make predictions these days. Once you make them in a television studio, I mean, when you leave here, but you already see that they've decided something else. So one should be careful. Claes, you want to get in?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in, but I totally want to second the notion that any analysis these days probably has a sort of a duration validity of about 2 hours and not more than that. But I wanted to go back to one of the, I think the crucial point, which is this sort of the harmful effect on society and who gets to be the arbiter of that, because I think there also lies one of the challenges of big tech and social media companies so far, because they have done, and we've seen that also through internal documents and Haugen's testimonies, that they have got a lot of internal and in-house research on what they're doing, and some of the push has been for them to sort of share that more widely and use that also as an assessment, as an impact. But I think the DSA, and I hope the end version of the DSA, will also interpret this assessment of potential harm really as something that is not up to the media companies and the big tech platforms only to determine, right? That is where we really need also a mechanism, and where the transparency measures are super, super important, but not only transparency as defined by the big tech companies themselves, right? We need to also create a system through which they need to improve their own transparency game and show more public-facing transparency, but we also need next to that a real good system for different types of data access and analysis, because one of our, I think, crucial challenges as a society, and even our discussion today, is that a lot of what we assume has happened and a lot of the roles that social tech and social media and big tech has played, whether it is in the January 6th or in the big elections of 2020, are still resting on a lot of assumptions and hearsay rather than systematic analysis and data access. And that is so crucial. We cannot, as a society, afford to go forward with designing a new infrastructure and new rules for this game without also ensuring a good way to have this data access. And that goes really beyond just the platforms themselves defining what they see as potential harmful and how they would want to mitigate that. We need data access to that, and next to that we probably need an auditing mechanism where we can look to, financial sectors, though not always a good place to look for good examples, but other places where there are independent bodies that can also play a role, so that we are not only forced to eat off the hand of transparency crumbles that are served by the platforms.
Excellent. Do you want to say something, Christel? Yeah, please.
No, but just briefly, but I completely agree. And in our suggestion for the Parliament, we also said that first and foremost, the Commission suggested that researchers should have access, vetted researchers. We agree, but we also say that we even think that we should have vetted NGOs because we think that we could need some help from the civil society to help checking. Of course, we need to take care of the competition and the right to have, trade secrets, you could say. The recipe for the algorithm might not go out to a competitor, but we need to make sure that the authorities, researchers, and in our point of view also vetted NGOs, because we believe that this transparency is key. And of course, we need to define a lot of things. It should not be up to the platforms themselves, but we will of course have to work with this governance structure. And on the basis of the DSA, there will be a lot of, maybe not a lot, but some delegated acts that will have to define these things. But before we can go into that, we need to know whether it will be the Commission who will take place and take care of the enforcement for the very large online platforms, or whether we will keep the structure we have today, where it's up to the national authorities to work with this.
Excellent. I'll just throw in some questions that we have in the chat. We start with a person who has a wonderful middle name, Friis, Thomas Friis Poulsen. He asked the following question: how do we ensure that the DSA will not just be seen as another monster, especially among the small and medium-sized European social media companies? Is that a risk, Christel?
No, at least not for the small ones. The Commission suggested that micro and small platforms should be exempted. The Parliament, even though I personally did not completely agree on this, also extended that to medium-sized. I think that we will probably end up exempting small and micro, but at least for the majority of the obligations, but they still will be. They still have to comply with some transparency and obligations. But I don't hope that we will end up with the kind of a bureaucratic monster. I always try to say that when we're negotiating, that I want a text that is clear and understandable, and that we need to take into account also how can this be enforced afterwards. But of course, I will not guarantee, because after we have finalized the piece of legislation we have here, it's not up to me any longer. Then it's up to the authorities to work with it. But no one wants a bureaucratic monster. Everyone wants to have as clear rules as possible and enforceable as possible.
Good. Then I have a question that deals specifically with the enforcement of this piece of legislation. And the question goes as follows: isn't that one of the core problems, or the Achilles heel of the DSA, that we could end up in a situation where we could have fragmentation, because we've seen that with GDPR. So we should have a strong EU level unit inside the European Commission, who could then oversee the very large online platforms and deal with them on an equal footing. What is your response to that with regards to the enforcement? Claes, do you want to start?
Well, I think that is actually a key challenge here, because the DSA and the Market Act and they are so encompassing, right, that it is hard, in my view, to see sort of any regulatory body taking on and having authority in all of this area. I think at the end of the day, this goes into different sectors. These are frameworks, and it will hard. I would have a hard time imagining devising a regular body that would have any just authority in overseeing all of this at the same time. Having said that, though, the challenge will then be that it does not end up being completely fragmented, and that each sector has its own rules. But there's a true challenge there. But these are such invasive and encompassing initiatives that I don't see a single regulatory body dealing with them.
Christel?
Well, see this as a forecast and not, I'm not revealing anything from the negotiations, but my guess will be that we will end up with a both, and that we will see that the national authorities will, for some platforms, especially the smaller ones, the medium-sized ones, will have to enforce them depending on the country of origin. And then for the very large online platforms, we will probably see that the Commission will get the role to enforce it. And this is not something completely new. We saw it, for instance, also with the type approval of vehicles, the legislation that came out of the Dieselgate scandal. I was working with that myself. And we ended up there making, asking the Commission, because we ended up didn't really trust the member states to check their cars, their own car industry. So we asked the Commission to establish an office where they could make a control of the control. So they had to have, checks of cars with, everything that is needed in order to check a car, not just the papers, but also physically checking the car. So we have seen it already in some legislative proposals that give the Commission an extra role, some powers to do things. Here they will probably end up being sole responsible for the enforcement of the very last online platforms. But this is a forecast. It's not I don't know for sure.
It's not breaking news. Well, that's that. But we have too much breaking news at the moment anyway. Bjarke Kværnø asked a question that I've actually also thought about while I was preparing for this. I mean, how do we secure that we don't kill what's good about SoMe, and also what's good about, that's what Bjarke also will ask here about Google. I mean, that it's so effective, and when you do your search, well, they have all the algorithms and so forth, and they basically then enables you to find the information that you want as fast as possible. I mean, how do we make sure that we don't lose that? Is that something that we should worry about? No, I can see, Christel, come on. What's your take on that?
I understand the question, and I think it's really a very good question. Will we end up destroying the good things of the big tech? But honestly, I don't think so. Honestly, I do believe that they will find their ways in this. What we're trying to do is that we're establishing a basic rule book. They don't have it today. It's kind of Wild West. We are asking them to act in a proper way, where you create a better level playing field. Yes, we have, of course, the e-commerce directive, but that's 20 years old. So that was before, Facebook was established, and at the time where Amazon was not running well and things like that. So in many ways, we really need this to create a better condition, and we need to have some rules about how they can harvest our data. And I do believe that it is possible for the companies to still have a good business where they will earn a lot of money, and we will be happy for their services. But maybe after the DSA has been adopted, they have to adjust a little bit and find the new ways. But then they can also use artificial intelligence and other. They always do that. They already do that. Even more, and find their ways to create new good businesses for us. I am sure that is possible. But I also have to say that if it's not possible, then I will live with it. Because I think that we need to understand the need to protect users' data much more than we are seeing today.
Maybe just adding very briefly, if that's okay, Lykke, I think that it's not about sort of fundamentally pulling the plug of big tech companies or social media companies or big search engines, but it's a question of an increased degree of transparency of what is happening. It is a question of increased sort of actionable rights to be enforced for you as an end user, and it is an increase of the need for us as a society to have a look in part of the engine room and say, okay, here we have an issue, this is something that we need to deal with. That does not undermine the core way that Google is operating, and even, for example, if Google would do less in terms of targeted, personalized or group-based targeting, they would still be a very healthy and financially viable company that can come up with extremely good and useful products and services going forward.
Okay, so no one is killing anything here. That sounds promising. Caroline has a question. How is the DSA related to digital labor platforms? And also, how is the DSA related to the regulation of online platforms supporting the sharing economy? So sharing of cars, other goods, other services. Any information on that, Christel?
Yeah, I mean, the platform workers regulation will not be a part of this, so it's another piece of legislation. But they have this in common, that it's about regulating the digital economy and regulating the fact that we will see data-driven economy in the future. So they have some basic things in common, but we're talking about different proposals. And for instance, when it's about platform workers, it's about defining, for instance, what is a worker, when are you self-employed and when are you employed by a company, and things like that. So that's more classical, trade union questions, honestly. And this is about our everyday life as users, either as businesses or as consumers when we shopping online, or as citizens when we try to meet friends or debate politics. So that's what the DSA is about. So not so much about workers' rights.
Okay. So you're not dealing with everything in this particular act.
No, but I have an opinion about everything. But I'm not sure with everything.
I'm sure. There's here also a question that goes back to a recent report from the French Senate, December 2021. Which recommended to deactivate by default targeted advertising and content recommendation systems. What's your view on that, Christel? Is that something would you support that to have that function?
I mean, when we started the discussion on the DSA in the Parliament, we had a discussion on whether we should completely ban targeted ads in general, not ads, but targeted ads or tracking ads. And that is, in fact, so that was one way to do it. Another way could say that, as a default option, when you go online, you are not tracked, but you can ask for it. Today, it's the other way around, more or less, that you are tracked, and then you have to scale up your privacy settings if you want to avoid some of the things, and you cannot avoid everything. So it's about how you see this. And especially on this question, I do believe that there is a right and left division on how to do it. So the more left you are, the more you tend to say that let's have default settings where you protect users from these kind of tracking ads to begin with. And then if you want to have it, you can scale down your protection. And if you're from the right side, you would say, no, let's start the other way around. And then you can change the settings and be better protected. So, I mean, more or less, the French proposal is discussing the same thing as we ended up suggesting in the Parliament. The only majority we had was to ban it for minors and not in general. So, but I believe that we have, I don't know where it ends on the DSA, but I think that we have only seen the beginning of this discussion about tracking ads or behavioral ads, because this is something that people are concerned about, and at least in the European Parliament, it's a huge debate. So I will expect more to come in the future.
Yeah,
and there we will also see the big tech companies, of course, rolling out sort of in their own race here, where Apple and Meta is already in a head-on sort of conflict about the ability to track across different apps and to make use of these data. And so there will also be an interesting business and industry development on this very topic in the next years.
Can we just spend a few minutes here at the end of our conversation on the term that you used, Christel, sort of getting into the black box of the algorithms? I mean, how optimistic are you with regards to that? I mean, how much will this DSA actually change with regards to that?
Well, I've been thinking about the work with the DSA. What is the most important part, in my opinion? What is the thing that can change mostly the way we look at the platforms? And I do believe that this work with the algorithms can have that impact. So if we end up with a good proposal where they end up, the platforms being accountable for what they're doing with their algorithms, and we open up this black box, I do believe that will be one of the things that will have the most positive impact out of the DSA. We will probably see less polarization online. We will hopefully see less negative issues for democracy, or even, we heard this story from Frances Haugen about young women on Instagram, that they ended up in these rabbit holes and only search on healthy food and ended up knowing about anorexia and self-injury and things like that. So I do believe that the algorithms can prevent that if we do it right, and that's why I think that it's so important that I kind of open up the black box. But of course, in order to end there, we need to have clear legislation, and we need to have a very good enforcement. And as Claes said, that we need to have, really, we need to find ways to define then what is a negative impact, and not just leave it to the platforms to decide their own definition.
Do you think that will happen, Claes?
Well, I mean, it of course sounds very nice, the opening of the black box, and in fact, it's a metaphor I often use myself, both in teaching and in talks. So from that perspective, I can relate to it. Having said that, that's also one that is hard, because the explication of an algorithm is also not something that's either always entirely possible nor entirely tangible for us as end users to understand. So it's a lot of it is also about understanding what criteria are going in there, to understand the parameters, to give the transparency of how you may be also able to change some of these settings, because of course there is sort of a bit of a nightmare scenario there, that it becomes a long cookie setting kind of description, and that's something that we generally want to avoid, right? Because then you might have shed some light into a gray or a black box, but not necessarily something that is entirely actionable on the user side. And the technologies there are also changing, right? So the more intelligent some of these systems become, and the less defined some of these algorithms are maybe in advance, and more sort of self-learning and organically developing algorithms, the harder this actually also becomes, and it becomes much more maybe about trying to explain what it is that goes in there, rather than saying, why am I seeing this particular advertisement or getting this particular price or this particular news story? I don't believe that level of transparency is even possible.
Christel?
On this, I agree. For me, it's not important that the end user understands the algorithms. Not at all. Myself personally would probably not understand it. No, I think that what is important is that that the authorities will look into it. People, experts will look into it, and so if we end up, for example, saying that the Commission needs to be the power to enforce this, then they need to hire people with skills into this, so that they understand when they have to check it out. So I agree with you that the parameters are important to find out, and we need to have somebody doing it for us, so that we can be safe but don't have to consider it. So for me, it's not the end user who really needs to know, but we need to make sure that there are no negative impact for the end user, even though we don't understand how all this works. Having said this, also that we have also an AI proposal in its making, so we also try to tackle some of that inside the AI proposal.
I'll make room here for a final question from Amy. How is the current text in the DSA on end-to-end encryption compatible with the EU's broader goals on the protection of minors?
I'm not really sure that I understood that question. Let me.
So basically, how is the current text in the DSA, the proposal we have on the table now, with regards to end-to-end encryption? How is that compatible with the EU's broader goals with regards to protection of minors?
Well, but this is in fact a really a tricky thing.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah, as every detail. You said it, the devil lies in the detail. That's the situation here. So let me try to make it a little bit more clear. We would like to protect minors, and we have a tendency, I suppose, the majority to say that it's good that we protect our kids. They are more vulnerable. So we want to protect them for getting these tracking ads, because if you get tracking ads, you have a profile and you know about their interest and things like that. You can categorize everything about them, and we don't want that to happen with minors. But in order to define, we don't ask, or you can ask for age, but people lie. So how can you really know whether or not a user is minor or not? And I suppose that many 11 years old preteens wants to be on Facebook, so they just say that they are 13 years old and no one is checking. But we know, so for Facebook, it might not be a problem because they compare data and do a lot of things. They have actual knowledge about the age of these minors, so they can identify this is a minor, this is not. But other platforms, they don't have the same, so they might have to ask for more data. And that is, that's one of the tricky things about this, is that, how can we make sure to protect minors and not to ask for too much more data, and the fact that we want people to have a chance also to be anonymous online. So it's there are many very complicated questions, and we haven't solved them yet, but we want principals to make sure that our kids are not tracked when they are online. That's very important. So we have to find solutions.
Good, and that's also why that this DSA will not be agreed upon tomorrow, but as you indicated during your first intervention, that April, maybe May will be sort of the time frame that we are looking into. I want to thank both of you, very much for taking time to talk to us about this very important piece of legislation. It will, as I think you've clearly highlighted, be a game changer, but it's also just one piece of a huge puzzle that we'll all be looking at the next couple of years. I also want to say that we've put in the chat your Twitter handles. So if you want to learn more about the DSA and follow the negotiations, but also the various sort of implications it has of the overall debate about democracy, do follow Claes and do follow Christel also. Claes and Christel almost sounds like a new television program that we could launch on this particular issue. And thank you very much also for making sort of the comparison with UEFA and FIFA and the tech giants. I'm not sure that if we had some of them listening in here, I'm sure we had that they will love that comparison. But as you know, Claes, we had FIFA and UEFA coming out on the right side of history with regards to banning the Russian teams and so forth. But that was a different story. So thank you very much for participating, and we'll also put this conversation on our website so you can also see it again and also share it. So thank you very much, and hang in there, and we hope for some better times for Europe as such, but and also thank you for the work that you're doing, Christel, with this particular piece of legislation. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye.